In 1945, the leaders of the biggest countries in the world sat down to plan peace. By the end of that same year, they were planning for conflict. So, what went wrong between Yalta and Potsdam? Let's get into it. All right, welcome back to another video of my IB History Revision Series. And in this one, we're going to cover Yalta versus Potsdam. So I'm looking to cover the differences between Yalta versus Potsdam. And I'm really trying to focus on this IB curriculum bullet point right here. This is all about the breakdown of the Grand Alliance, right? In my opinion, this is a question that the IB really goes to often, an iteration of this question, a question in this bullet point right here. So you have to be able to understand all of the nuances at the start of the Cold War. What I like to tell my students is that the Cold War is a lot different than World War II, right? It's a Cold War. It's not a hot war. There wasn't a bullet that was fired to indicate the start of a hot conflict, right? This was a Cold War, so it's a little bit more ideological, it's a little bit more nuanced, so finding that start point is a little bit hard. So I think one of the first steps in your journey of understanding the Cold War is figuring out when you think it starts, and that might help you kind of develop your thesis or your historical interpretation as you continue your revision. So yeah, let's get into it. The Yalta Conference. All right, so just as a little bit of context about what's going on in Yalta, it's February 4 through 11th of 1945, and it is located in Yalta, which is in Crimea, the former Soviet Union. All right, very, 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 very key point here, and hopefully this makes sense later on. World War II in Europe is not yet over. So we can make the statement that Yalta is a wartime conference, right? Now, everybody there knows the war is going to be over soon, right? The question of who will win the war is no longer in question. It's no longer in doubt. They just don't know how much longer the war is going to be fought for. It could be a couple months, could be a year, but they know that the Allies are going to be victorious, right? So that's a very, very, very key point in understanding some of the proceedings that follow the Yalta Conference. All right, the leaders, we've got the big three. We've got Churchill, we've got Roosevelt, we've got Stalin. This is the picture, or one of the few pictures that we actually have taken at the Yalta Conference. Now, to understand this, I think that you really have to be able to understand the relationship between these two individuals right here. All right, we've got obviously, or hopefully obviously, Franklin Roosevelt and Joseph Stalin. So those two individuals had a pretty substantial amount of respect for one another, right? They did not see eye to eye on many things, all right? You have FDR, the guy who tried to be the protector of the free world, and you had Joseph Stalin, a dude that killed millions of his own people in order to, consolidate power, right? You've got guys that are cut from two very separate cloths, but they had respect for each other as leaders, right? So again, another thing that I like to talk about with my students when we're learning about this for the first time is just negotiation in general, right? When you go into a business meeting or a meeting or whatever you plan to do with the rest of your life, right? Most of the time you don't go into a meeting planning on dominating, right? Planning on winning every facet of what the meeting is about, right? You go into a meeting with the understanding that you're going to have to compromise, right? When you compromise, you probably make a list, 1 through 5. I want number 1, and I'm willing to sacrifice number 5 to get it, right? That's compromise. That's negotiation. That's how a lot of meetings work. Both of those individuals went into the Yalta Conference and the conferences that came before Yalta too, with the understanding that there is going to be compromise, right? That neither one of them are going to walk out with bullet points 1 through 5 on their list, that they were going to compromise. There were going to be things that they had to sacrifice to get to their ultimate goal. And that's another thing. All three of them are A, individuals, and B, represent very different countries. So they have different goals. They have different motivations going into the Yalta Conference. All right. Here we go. So Yalta, what is agreed upon? There are a couple of firm, solid, agreed upon, understandings at the Yalta Conference. Number one, hopefully you know this already. I've mentioned it in a couple of other videos, especially the one that I just did about the First Berlin Conference. But Germany would be divided into 4 different zones of occupation. You've got a British zone, a French zone, an American zone, and a Soviet zone. Okay? Berlin would also be divided into the same 4 zones. All right, we talked about that already. If you don't understand that, go back to my First Berlin Crisis video to shed some light onto that. Another kind of major agreed upon thing, and this didn't take a lot of convincing by either side, is that all the Nazi war criminals would be put on trial in something that's going to be later called the Nuremberg trials, right? I'm going to go down to this bottom one right here because this was FDR's number one. Okay, this was the one thing that FDR was not willing to sacrifice. This was a major discussion point around the Yalta Conference, and it was about the United Nations, right? He wanted to establish the United Nations. He wanted to try and fix some of the flaws that the League of Nations left behind and make the United Nations a much stronger, more long-lasting group that would preserve peace. So that's FDR's number one, and he gets it agreed upon at the Yalta Conference, which was a huge win for Roosevelt. On the other side of things, Eastern Europe. Now, Eastern Europe is a little bit tricky here, all right? They all agree that in Eastern Europe, the Nazi-liberated countries would hold free and fair elections. Now, free and fair, what does that mean? Roosevelt and Stalin have very different interpretations of what free and fair elections in Eastern Europe are going to look like, which is going to be a point of conflict moving forward. Poland, they don't do a good job here, all right? The vibes are ultimately good at the Yalta Conference, right? Again, you got mutual respect, you've got negotiation, you've got some sacrifice, you've got some winning, you've got, drinks pouring in the evening after dinner. The vibes are overall good. They know that they're not going to agree on what's going on in Poland. So they are going to kick the can on the Poland issue. All right. Stalin wants his sphere of influence to be extended into Poland. The West wants their sphere of influence to be extended into Poland. They know it's going to be an area of contention. They don't talk about it very much at Yalta, or they talk about it a good amount. They don't come to any conclusion about what goes on in Poland. All right. Another major point is Japan, right? So the war in Europe is nearing an end. The war in Japan is still going on, and there's no sign of quit from the Japanese forces yet. So they agreed that Stalin will enter into the war in Japan to try and help out his American allies. All right, so that's the Yalta Conference. Those are the agreed upon terms. Tensions. Now, again, I talked about it a little bit. Poland. All right. Stalin had very close ties with the Lublin Poles, all right, the Poles that remained in Poland during the war. Some of the biggest names and forces within the Polish resistance were of kind of a communist persuasion, whereas Churchill and Roosevelt had much closer ties to the democratic Poles, the ones that fled Poland and took exile in London for the entirety of the war. So there is a lot of tension rubbing back and forth between the two kind of main ideologies surrounding Poland and who would win in an ultimate election if it were to come to that. All right. I already said it, right? Free elections. What does that mean? Stalin has a very different interpretation of what that means. Stalin is one of the most paranoid individuals in world history. He's not going to really let things up to free will, right? That's not really the kind of guy that he is. So in the back of his head, he's never really agreeing to what the West thinks he's agreeing to. And then building off of that, we've got trust issues, right? In person, in kind of the common rooms of the Yalta Conference, everything is going fine. Everything is going well. It's all laughs. It's jokes. There's some tense moments, but again, overall, the vibes of Yalta are good. Behind the scenes, not so much. There are a lot of closed-door meetings. There's a lot of, winks and nods. And, Stalin had most of the rooms bugged, so he knew what Churchill was telling his aides. He knew what Churchill was telling Roosevelt behind the scenes. So there was definitely a mounting distrust between the two, but it wasn't enough to spoil the Yalta Conference. Again, overall, the Yalta Conference is a wartime conference that's marked by cooperation. I'm going to say that one more time. It's a wartime conference that's marked by cooperation. okay? Some historiography for you, right? If you're an Orthodox historian, again, just knowing that on your exam and being able to cite what school of history you're representing in either your thesis or a paragraph. An Orthodox historian will say that Stalin, kind of at the Yalta Conference, never intended for Eastern European freedom. A revisionist historian would say that the West was demanding too much from Stalin, who was representing a war-torn nation, a nation that got invaded and destroyed by the Nazis. A post-revisionist is going to say that it's kind of both sides equally, and that both sides had misunderstanding and different priorities that led to the conflict that was brewing. All right, and then I have a quote for you by John Lewis Gaddis that if you're into it, you can pause the video now and read it. Now, let's switch gears to the Potsdam Conference. All right. Potsdam, much different conference just by context alone. All right. The Potsdam Conference happens after World War II in Europe is over. All right. The Germans have signed their unconditional surrender. So the Potsdam Conference is not a wartime conference. The Potsdam Conference is a peacetime conference, and that changes the whole, again, the nuances is very important here. That changes the whole scope and scale of the conference itself. All right, but that's not the biggest change. The biggest change comes in the representatives who are present at the Potsdam Conference. Number one, most important thing to remember, Franklin Roosevelt dies. All right, Roosevelt never sees the end of World War II at all in Europe, specifically for this video. Right, Harry Truman, his vice president, all right, is going to become the next president of the United States. Now, if you study history of the Americas, this will be a little bit more easy to understand. But Harry Truman, Roosevelt won 4 different elections in the United States. Okay, he's president for 13 years. All right, he's got He's got different vice presidents in his first and then second and third terms. By his 4th term, all right, because of infighting of the Democratic Party, his previous vice president, Henry Wallace, is going to be ousted and Harry Truman is replaced. Not by Roosevelt, by the Democratic Party. Roosevelt and Truman don't get along very well. They don't have a great relationship. And Truman has only been vice president for, I think, under 100 days at the time of the Potsdam Conference. All right? So that's one. That's the most major difference. Number 2, Churchill is going to be voted out mid-conference. He's at the start of the conference, but he's voted out mid-conference and replaced by Clement Attlee. Going back to Yalta, Stalin and FDR were the drivers of the Yalta Conference, but Churchill is such a strong personality that he was able to steer that ship very well between the two, definitely carve out his own agenda, but steer the boat if times were getting rough. Attlee is not the same character as Churchill. He didn't have the ability to right the ship between Truman and then the only consistent member of the two conferences, Joseph Stalin. All right? Now, here's a picture of the 3. I told you when we looked at the picture of the Yalta Conference, it's about cooperation. It's about respect between FDR and Stalin. No respect, no love lost between these two. All right? Stalin respected FDR. FDR respected Stalin. Stalin does not respect Harry Truman. He doesn't even really know who he is. And Harry Truman does not like Joseph Stalin. Harry Truman is a much more conservative Democrat. He's a staunch anti-communist. He grew up during the Red Scare of the 1920s. He does not trust Stalin. He does not want communism to have an influence in Eastern Europe like FDR was willing to capitulate to get the United Nations signed. He was willing to hand over parts of Eastern Europe as a sphere of influence, which might mean communism spreading. Truman was not willing to do that. So right off the bat, you've got not only lack of respect, but you've got a distrust that begins to bubble up between those two individuals, and you don't have Churchill there to kind of fix it, right? There are some agreements at the Potsdam Conference, right? They firmly agreed to the division of Germany. Reparations are agreed upon as an idea, but they do not get very specific at how reparations are going to be collected from Germany. Obviously, Stalin fights for reparations really hard because his country is so destroyed. If you learned about World War II and the practices at all, you know about scorched earth, and you know about all of the terrible devastation of human life that happened on the Eastern Front of World War II. He needs to rebuild his country, and he needs to do it really fast. All right. Poland. Now that issue is going to come into play, right? They didn't agree upon Poland very, very firmly at the Yalta conference, and now this is where that nuance comes into play. Stalin had troops physically in Eastern Europe during the Yalta conference, but he wasn't doing anything wrong because it was a wartime conference. He was still trying to defeat the Nazis. So no one thought anything of it when the Red Army is populating these soon-to-be Nazi-liberated places. But now, by the Potsdam Conference, it's a peacetime conference. The war is over. Stalin does not withdraw his troops, all right? Stalin does not send, obviously they're not all going to be gone, but he doesn't even begin to withdraw troops from many of these Eastern European, these Nazi-liberated states, right? That was something that was agreed upon at Yalta that should have been enforced by Potsdam and was never enforced, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a second. One of the other major agreements is the Potsdam Declaration, which is essentially a declaration sent to the Japanese saying that they must sign an unconditional surrender or else the war is going to get pretty ugly for them pretty quickly. All right, we can get into that maybe in another video. That has a lot of nuances from the justification of the U.S. dropping the atomic bomb that maybe if I have time this cycle, I'll try to get a video on that in there. All right, here we've got that division of Germany. All right, so the disagreements, right? Stalin has his troops in Eastern Europe. All right, this is going to start that distrust. All right, if you're Harry Truman, you are going to say that Joseph Stalin broke the spirit of Yalta. If you're talking about these two conferences or you're talking about the origin of tensions in the Cold War, you have to know that phrase, the spirit of Yalta. Truman will claim that Stalin broke the spirit of Yalta by having troops occupy Eastern European lands now, right? He's not holding them to free elections. He's occupying them, and the salami tactics have begun, right? He's beginning to carve away these places and add them into the Soviet, entity. On the other hand, Stalin is going to say that Truman is the one breaking the spirit of Yalta because he is not telling him about the big secret, all right? Stalin is supposed to enter the war in Japan soon, right? That time is coming now that the Nazis have been dealt with, yet Truman's got this bomb that he just learned about a couple days prior, right? The first test of the atomic bomb happened, I think, 3 days before the Potsdam Conference. Truman was already in Europe when the test goes down. Harry Truman, I gave you the exact quote. We have a new weapon of unusually destructive force. That's the only thing he mentions at the entire conference to his wartime ally in the Pacific, Joseph Stalin, right? Stalin knew about the bomb before Truman even knew about the bomb because FDR didn't give him the security clearance to learn about the Manhattan Project as vice president because he didn't like him very much. That's, again, a story for another day. Stalin had spies on the Manhattan Project, and he's sitting at the Potsdam Conference like, why is my ally not telling me he's got a bomb that can quite literally end the war in Asia, in the Pacific, right? So again, you've got lack of respect. You've got distrust that's mounting between the two leaders. All right. Why is Potsdam a turning point? We're not wartime allies anymore, right? The Grand Alliance, if you can make the claim that it broke by Potsdam, or you can make the claim that the cracks are obvious, right? And that the break is about to come. All right. Historians debate all the time on if the Cold War started at the Potsdam Conference or if it starts in 1947 with the Truman Doctrine. I tend to think that the Truman Doctrine is really what starts it, but again, that's for another video altogether. All right? A little historiography here about the Potsdam Conference, right? If you're an Orthodox, you're going to say that Harry Truman broke his promises and started to expand communism. If you're a revisionist, you say that Harry Truman is at fault because he didn't share about atomic technology. If you're a post-revisionist, you say both are equally to blame. Yalta versus Potsdam. Conclusion. Yalta, fragile, definitely some turmoil, but overall a peacetime conference of cooperation. Potsdam, mistrust and tension specifically between Truman and Stalin is going to be the headline, right? And that mistrust dominates the conference. Okay? Some revision tips. If you need to remember kind of the main points about the Yalta and Potsdam Conference, you can remember peace. Poland, elections, are they going to be free? I don't know. Look at that thumbs up. That's cool. Atomic bomb, control of Europe, and Eastern Europe, right? So peace is a really good acronym to help you remember the major issues between the two conferences. All right? Some exam style analysis right here. Again, Yalta, cooperation, Potsdam, breakdown. Evidence, agreements versus reality. We agreed for free election. In reality, Stalin occupied a lot of those zones. Distrust, the atomic bomb, right? And then who broke the spirit of Yalta first? Being able to articulate both perspectives on that phrase, spirit of Yalta, I think is key to understanding this. All right? I hope that video helped you guys. As I said in my last video, I do kind of want a little call to action from you guys, especially if you stuck around this long. I'm really enjoying making these videos, but I'm also kind of I'm hoping that you guys are finding them useful. Let me know that you're finding it useful by, dropping a like, leaving a comment, and make sure you subscribe because I'm going to be dropping more videos before this session of IB exams and definitely building on this going forward next year and making more videos just like this one. If it helped, let me know. Good luck on your exams.